Welcome to Two Republics, where we spotlight global voices, youth-led dialogue, and the future of U.S. India relations. Glad you're here, and I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Today, we have the privilege of speaking with Mr. Dhruva Jaishankar, one of the leading voices in U.S. India relations and global geopolitics. He has had an incredible career from his work at the Fellow at Brookings India and the German Marshall Fund to his pivotal role in founding ORF America, where he now serves as executive director. He's written extensively on global security, defense policy, and India's growing role on the world stage. We're excited to dive into his expertise today and hear his thoughts on the future of the U.S. India partnership. Thank you so much for being here and speaking on Two Republics.
Thank you, Gaurav.
You've had such a fascinating career path. Looking back at all the major geopolitical shifts over the years, I'm curious what moments or events have shaped your views on foreign policy? And in the hindsight, how did those moments influence the way you see India and the United States place in the global conversation today?
That's a good question. I probably can give a very long answer about that because there's so many. I think so. Three things to keep in mind. I grew up both in India and outside of India, but as an Indian living abroad, in the 1980s and 1990s. And this was a time, again, I think maybe a younger generation of Indians particularly don't necessarily appreciate this, but this is a time when there were a lot fewer Indians abroad. It was very rare, and sometimes coming across another Indian or somebody with a connection to India who had been there. So, in some ways, even growing up, I found very naturally my role was in some ways explaining India to the world. In some ways, that's what I do professionally. So I think again, that was a very different time. It was during the Cold War. India was much more economically sort of inward looking. Before this was before, in some cases, before liberalization in 1991, or even in the early years after
Right.
that. 1998, the nuclear tests and the Kargil War were actually quite pivotal moments because it sort of, in some ways, maybe not always for good reasons, but for the first time, the world started to look at India and take it
Yeah.
seriously. And then also again, you really saw with the software boom in like 1999, 2000 onwards that again, people started to look at India in a new light, which was as a source of talent, a source of engineering skill. It became known for IT. So I think there was one, I sort of grew up in that milieu and that environment, which I think shaped a lot of things. And I think sometimes we don't appreciate, particularly a younger generation doesn't appreciate how far India has traveled and some of the real difficulties that India has had to overcome in the past. So in some ways, when we have challenges today, I'm a lot more sanguine about that, a lot more because again, we've experienced far worse in the past, a time when India was much more constrained, um, uh, and much more vulnerable. I think a second set of things were just when I came of age, in some ways as an adult, and it was the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, a number of events maybe up to the time of the Beijing Olympics and the global financial crisis. And for me, that was like early. I was a student. That was early in my career, but that sort of very much shaped my adulthood in some ways. And then I think there were the events of like the last 15 years or so, which have been a real shift from um, the US and Europe to Asia. Has been something, I worked at a place called the German Marshall Fund, which was an organization dedicated to US Europe relations. And we set up, when I joined, a few of us were establishing an Asia program. And we had to face day to day arguments within the organization as to why should this organization even have anything focused on Asia. And just to educate even our own colleagues about there were major developments taking place in China and India and Southeast Asia that would have global repercussions. So I think that these changes have occurred in some cases, quite dramatic changes, even in my professional life in the last 20 years, which really have changed in some ways people's worldview. And again, I would signify a few big pivotal moments. The 9/11 attacks were one. The global financial crisis was another. I think the COVID pandemic, a combination of three things: COVID pandemic, the China-India clashes of 2020, and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, all three happening in very quick succession. Donald Trump's election have really fundamentally changed a lot of people's approaches to international affairs.
Yeah, no, as a member of, Gen Z, the timeline I've seen of India's growth is obviously very different, and it's important to recognize India's growth from the 1990s and now. It's very easy to look at all the problems India has today, but forget where it's come from and to see the growing shift. One of the things that stands out in the India-US dynamic is India's careful management of its strategic autonomy. And recently, there's been increased attention and Washington's role in some tensions between India and Pakistan specifically. It feels that it could be a significant moment in the US-India relationship. Given that, how do you assess the impact of Washington's involvement in the recent Operation Sindoor and India-Pakistan clash on New Delhi's strategic autonomy and public perception of the US-India partnership?
So I'm going to split that question to two. I think there is a larger question of strategic autonomy. Um, and then there's a second question related to the recent developments, and I think they should each be addressed somewhat separately. One is, I think strategic autonomy is very misunderstood because one big problem with it is that many, both in India and abroad, mistake it for a goal when it is actually a means to an end, right? It is India believes, India had different choices at different times about whether to ally, and I use this term very specifically, with someone during the Cold War or after the Cold War. And for a variety of reasons, India has opted not to become an ally. And to the point where, in many cases, it isn't even on offer. So today, the US isn't even asking India to be an ally, right? Which is, I think, a bit of there was a recent article that made a lot of waves, which was criticizing India for not being an ally. But the fact is that Donald Trump doesn't want the US to have more allies, let alone a country like India. So I think that question of strategic autonomy was particularly important in the context of India developing its own nuclear arsenal, which is India calculated by the mid 1980s, early 1990s, that it was facing two nuclear-armed adversaries, China and Pakistan. At that time, Pakistan's nuclear arsenal was more advanced than India's in the mid-1980s. And that India was not going to get a nuclear deterrent from the Soviet Union, later Russia, or from the United States. And so it had to develop one on its own, even if it came at a significant cost, right? So that was where the context of strategic autonomy came from. But today we're in a world where strategic autonomy is the norm, right? So Europe, for example, which has long linked its strategic security to the United States in the form of NATO and other arrangements, today is now talking about strategic autonomy. That Europe says we cannot rely on the United States to always come to our aid, and so we must actually develop our own ability to defend ourselves. Now, India in some ways is already at that point, right? India has always been at that point. So I don't think strategic autonomy is today in question. That is a natural state of being for India, but it has also got a historical precedent. So I think there's a lot of things, again, people often mistake strategic autonomy as a goal. It is not a goal. It is a means to an end, which is a way of making India more strong, prosperous, and secure. And that's not going to change. And in fact, I think that strategic autonomy, at least at this point of time, in a world where Donald Trump is president of the United States and is resetting the terms of engagement with a lot of its allies, including Europe, including Japan, including Australia, India's strategic autonomy is going to serve it well in this, because India is already there. It's these other U.S. allies that are struggling to come to terms with with strategic autonomy. The second thing on how. So the short answer is, I think India-U.S. relations will be affected by the U.S. handling of Operation Sindoor and its management. But I do think a few facts need to be kept in mind. A few things. So India suffered a horrific terrorist attack on April 22nd of this year at Pahalgam in Kashmir, in which civilians were deliberately targeted, right? And I think just based on past precedents, India felt it had to respond with some kinetic action against the perpetrators and enablers of that terrorist attack, which it did. The US, for the most part, was quite supportive of India at the outset. That this was a terrorist attack. It actually moved language to the UN that was quite supportive of, condemnatory of Pakistan, which China and others blocked. Also, when India did finally retaliate on May 7th, 8th, 9th, the US again only called for a sort of a de-escalation of tensions, but did not condemn India's right to respond to the Pahalgam attacks. So far, so good. I think what changed was on May 10th, the last day of the conflict, when Pakistan said that they wanted a cessation of hostilities with India.
Yep.
First, before the Donald Trump took credit for that, India says it was basically India believes it was as a response to India's strikes on particularly Pakistani airfields that compelled Pakistan to take the step. But essentially, Trump taking credit for it gave Pakistan a bit of a way out. So that was, I think, one challenge. I think, secondly, various U.S. officials, not just Trump, said that India had agreed, for example, to wide-ranging talks in a neutral third country, which is something India says they never agreed to, which is something Pakistan has been asking for a while. And then I think subsequently, things like the visit of the army chief, the Pakistan army chief, Munir, to Washington, have also added to this belief in India that the U.S. has been taking, at best, an even-handed role in this. Basically putting India and Pakistan on the same plane, if not actually being somewhat more sympathetic to Pakistan. So unfortunately, a U.S.-India relationship that had actually been developing quite well, even under the Trump
Yeah.
administration. We had a very successful visit by Prime Minister Modi, some very meaningful cooperation in a number of domains. Now, I think there are questions being asked in India about how much the U.S. can be relied upon. Now, I think hopefully this is just a tactical blip. Pakistan feels it is needed for a number of things, including the hostilities in Iran, some counterterrorism cooperation, some nuclear security issues. And they've also appealed to Trump's self-image as a peacemaker. So again, the U.S. is making these decisions, but it will obviously decrease the window or the appetite in New Delhi for engaging in any kind of extraordinary way. Obviously, in practical terms, that will continue. We're still seeing continuation of trade talks even after this. Hopefully, we'll have some resolution on that soon. There's continuing cooperation on technology, on even on defense, but I think you won't see India going the extra mile in a way, at least for the near future. And so again, the question is, is this, and really in some ways the ball is in Washington's court. Is this a tactical shift, or is this something longer which will mark the next 4 years?
Yeah, despite those initial like blips, like you said, the global race for technological dominance is only intensifying. And that's one area where we see both countries having a stable partnership. And it's the center, especially with AI and cybersecurity being such critical areas. What unique challenges do you see in this cooperation, and how do you see it playing out in the larger context of global governance, specifically if we look at technology?
I think sometimes there's a race for technology's sake. People like to have the flashiest toys. Let's think of this in very practical terms. I think there needs to be an assessment, and we don't know because the rate of technological change is so fast, and the applications are so uncertain at this point of time, particularly commercial applications. But we are going to see some major breakthroughs. We don't know exactly where and in what ways that's going to happen. But I think the key question is, what are going to be the main drivers of economic growth and national security over the next decade or two? And there are going to be some applications of this. So, it's one thing to have AI development to create, create fun AI art, right? But the real thing is, just to take the example of AI, in what ways will AI really contribute to economic growth and development and employment? On the one hand, and secondly, how will it actually affect national security and military competition as well? I think those are the sort of two ways of looking at it. And so I think a lot of emphasis needs to be placed on applications, and this is something every government around the world is struggling with in different ways. The US and India both have certain natural advantages and certain natural disadvantages, and I think that has led to some areas of complementarity between the US and India when it comes to some of these emerging technologies. The US has obviously a very competitive innovations ecosystem. It has venture capital funds. It has an appetite for risk. It has certain things that are enabling certain breakthroughs. But these are very resource intensive breakthroughs. They require a lot of capital, a lot of cost, top talent, all of that, right? India doesn't. India is sometimes seeking other goals, which is sort of, for example, you harnessing some of those commercial applications of these emerging technologies for its own economic growth, for development objectives, for right. I think in some ways there's not the same objectives, but there are certain complementarities. And I think what both governments are trying to explore and find is where can they actually leverage those things with each other, but also looking at other partners as well. So for India, I think the question is, can you do some of the same things in a more resource efficient way? Can you, again, where will the upside be, right? In many ways, the idea the Indian innovation ecosystem is not going to look exactly like the US innovation ecosystem, right? So that's where there's complementarities. The other challenge is, while this is a matter of public policy, in many respects, the implementation arm of this, both in the US and India, is going to be private companies. So it's one thing for the governments to agree, we want to do X, and sometimes they genuinely do want to do that. But it will require making the business case to an Indian company and a US company to collaborate on this together. In some cases, they want to do it, some cases they don't. Then the government can play a facilitating role, or, for example, the US can play a difficult role on export controls. In some cases, on sensitive technologies, there are export controls. So that's where the role of the government comes in. But one of the challenges, again, I think, is there are many areas where the US and India would like to collaborate more. These have been outlined quite extensively, but when it comes to actual practical cooperation, it requires somebody to put money, somebody to sink that investment in. It requires the business case to be made both in the US and India, which look very different from each other, for all of this to result in real tangible cooperation.
Yes, that's very insightful. One of the things that I've always found most fascinating is how India's global influence isn't just, driven by economic or military might. We also talked about technology a bit, but it's also powered by soft power like cultural diplomacy, and other global partnerships. You can look at India's influence through Bollywood, yoga, and even its role in those capacities. Do you think that India is fully maximizing its soft power potential? Or is there still room for growth? And what trends in this area are you most excited about right now?
Right. So, I mean, look, again, I think those two terms, soft power and cultural diplomacy, are often used interchangeably, but they should not be.
Okay.
Soft power traditionally is the power of attraction, right? It is, are people attracted to your country and think positively of you? And to a large extent, that's not something governments do very well, right? Governments aren't very good exponents to soft power. It is really about a place of values, culture. Do you stand for something? So I'll give a few examples of that. The classic case is, there were many countries in Eastern Europe during the Cold War that wanted to, where the people, not the governments, the people wanted to integrate more with Western Europe and the United States. They were attracted to rock music and pop culture, of academic freedom, things like that, right? And so they wanted to move to the West. So despite the fact that the governments were often antagonistic towards each other, the people ultimately, or many people, particularly younger people in certain demographics, wanted a closer relationship with the West. That's, I think, a good example of soft power. It didn't happen because the US was exporting it actively, right? In some cases, the US didn't like the music. The US government didn't like the music and the movies that were coming out in the 60s and 70s, but that was actually what made them attractive. So I don't think that, so does India have soft power? Yes. People are increasingly traveling to India, or we could do much a better job of attracting tourists and things like that. But people like going to Indian weddings. People, most people who know Indians have good, speak positively about their Indian friends. Indians are reasonably well integrated in many parts of the world, right? So I think just intangibly there is that soft power, but governments don't do a good job generally of growing it. And let me give you the example. There's something called the ICCR, which is an organization meant to export Indian culture, and they support, for example, Indian classical musicians and dancers going abroad. But they don't support Bollywood movies necessarily. They don't support pop culture. That actually is what draws crowds. And you go places in the Middle East, you go Central Asia, you go other places, and people like Shah Rukh Khan are A.R. Rahman are big figures. That's not ICCR. That's not because of ICCR, right? So I think that there's governments generally don't do a very good job of promoting what is popular. In some ways, they don't need to. But I think that there's a soft power equation. Cultural diplomacy, I think, is a different matter. I think there's certain, yoga is a good example. Yoga became popular around the world not because of any initiative of the Indian government. What the Indian government is now trying to do is say, because yoga is popular around the world and because it originated in India, we want to associate with that because we have millions of people around the world practicing yoga. And so creating an International Day of Yoga, which was just celebrated 2 days
Yes, a
ago,
couple of days ago. Yeah.
yeah, Saturday, is a good example of the Indian government now trying to associate itself with something that was naturally very popular around the world. So we shouldn't be shy about associating ourselves with that. If there are yogic practitioners on the way, they need to, when they think of yoga, they should also think of India, right? So that's I think that's where the something like the International Day of Yoga becomes more important. So that's a long way of saying, are there ways that India could do? Absolutely, yes. I think a good sort of proxy measure in the near future that I would look at is how many tourists and visitors we get to India. India is, sort of, if you travel around, is marvelous. It is varied. It has such a rich history and culture, and yet so many people from abroad only see a very one-dimensional aspect of that. They only see, they visit a few places: Delhi, Mumbai, Agra, Jaipur. They don't see a lot more of the country. So I think building up that tourist infrastructure, bringing people in, making it an attractive place for students, and not just people of Indian origin, but people. One thing that sort of sometimes distresses me is I go to a lot of Indian functions in other countries. Whether it's on policy, whether it's cultural, and the people in the audience are largely people of Indian origin.
Right.
And I think we need to make an extra effort. I organized something recently where we had an audience which was people who had no prior or very little prior experience with India,
Right.
and actually got some criticism saying, "Why didn't you invite more Indians to it?" And I said, "Well, that's not the point. There are many other opportunities for that, but we need to actually do. It's a bit harder. You have to get out of your comfort zone, but we have to do a better job of reaching out to people who are not necessarily people of Indian origin, even."
Yeah, that effort of going outside of the NRI population and, presenting the country to a whole is, I think that's very important. Kind of
I
as a
mean, that's something I actually try and spend a lot of time doing, which is trying to do that.
Yeah. Kind of as a final question, you've contributed so much to shaping this discourse around U.S. India relations and global diplomacy. Looking at your work, what do you hope it will contribute to the broader narrative of diplomacy and international relations? And looking ahead, how do you think the next generation can continue to build on this foundation to carry this partnership forward?
I mean, those are big questions. Let me take, so one is I think that there are two aspects to it, to my part, and then the next generation is separate. One is I think I see the frankly, India literacy is very poor. I mean, even in India, but certainly outside of India, right? So I think one is just at a very basic level, just simply educating people or informing them about various aspects of India is a start, right? And there's a long way to go to do that. I mean, sort of it's sometimes feels like a very a really uphill task to inform, because the level of misconception and sometimes the lack of, people don't care, people's knowledge is outdated. So there's
Yeah.
a lot more that can be done to introduce, and India is a very complex society. It's arguably one of the most complex, diverse societies in the world. So explaining that in a language that the audience will understand is one aspect of it. The second is, so complement to that is, I don't think, I think sometimes presenting an Indian perspective on global issues is important, right? Why should not the country, which is the world's largest has the world's largest population, not have thoughts about global affairs because it has interests that are global, right? So whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Latin America, which I've been spending more time on recently, or in the Indo-Pacific, there are global developments that have direct or indirect implications for India. And so Indians should have a view on that. Should have a so sometimes I don't I think just adding to the diversity of voices on international affairs is important in and of itself, whether it's Indian, whether it's others. And part of what we do, what we try to do at ORF and ORF America, is actually amplify other voices as well, not just Indian, but other perspectives from Africa, from Latin America, that don't always get the
More of the global south area, right?
Well, more the global south, yeah. So, I mean, the fact is, you do have thoughtful, articulate people in all of these places, and yet it's if you watch, say, U.S. I mean, or European commentary on any international event, you don't hear those voices very much. It's you hear a pretty standard set of people whose views have been pretty defined and well known and shaped by a certain set of cultural and historical circumstances, and so that I think is important. So I think these are complementary, explaining India to the world, but also explaining the world in some ways to India, or offering an Indian perspective on global affairs. It's not just, we shouldn't just be parochially focused on what is happening in India and why it matters narrowly for Indian interests. So I think that's, I'd say, that's part of the ongoing effort, and that's what I see the role of a organization like ORF America. The reason we have an Indian affiliated organization outside of India is precisely for that purpose. It's to provide that ideas bridge between India and the rest of the world. And in terms of the kinds of products, what we write and what we how we convene, it's that is really the purpose. How can others build upon it? I think there's a lot more that can be done. There's so many areas that are very underserved. I'll give you a few examples. I haven't found a good book ever written on India-Russia relations.
Yeah.
And now it requires somebody to understand Russian. It requires, but that's a very easy. There's not been good recent work on India Southeast Asia relations, even though there's a lot happening in India Southeast Asia space, particularly on the defense side. Nothing recently that's good on Indian trade policy, which has shifted quite dramatically in the past 10 years. So again, these are just a few examples, but it would require a level of discipline that I think it require many years of effort to go into that. It would require a certain set of skills, people to develop a certain set of skills. So, I mean, those are just a few examples off the top of my head, but there's a lot more that can be done in each of these areas. And, again, the fact, I'll give another example. In Washington, where I am, there are at least 3, 4 institutions just dedicated to Middle East policy. I mean, entire institutions, not
Yeah.
just individuals, right? Some of them quite large, only focused on this one region. We have one recently set up, which is focused on India. So we should have 3 or 4, right, over
Right.
time, right? So
Given the
so
population.
it's yeah, the population, the interest, the breadth, again, the NRI community, there are many reasons to do that. So all I'm saying is, I think there's a lot more that can be done in the future. I think a lot using new technologies. Again, another thing I found, younger people are very good at setting up, using social media. They're much more media savvy than people even of my generation, let alone people 10 or 20 years older than me. Um, and but I haven't seen any sort of good it requires both a diligence, a sort of deep understanding of issues, but also a way of communicating that in an effective way. And I haven't found somebody who's got a good marriage of those two things. There are plenty of podcasts and video series and social media feeds, but I haven't found many that offer a degree of depth and sophistication that is what is required to better understand and to really shed light on new developments. So all of this is a long way of saying there's a lot more that can be done.
Right. No, that's perfectly well put. I think that there's definitely a lot of work that's already out there, but there's also more stuff that, people can put out. So I'd like to thank you so much for sharing your insights with our viewers here at Tour Public. Definitely very enjoyable.